Hi there, my name is Uzo Ehiyog and this is Integrated Clinical Strength and Conditioning. This video is brought to you in association with Rehab Guru. Today's video is all about how to structure your rehabilitation sessions. Unfortunately, in the world of physiotherapy and skill acquisition, the structuring of rehabilitation sessions is often neglected. So what we're going to provide for you in this very short video is some tips and some tricks in regards to how to make your sessions as effective as possible from a skill development and also a motor learning perspective, so you can improve the fortunes of your patients. Hope you enjoyed the video and thanks for watching. The structure of the rehabilitation session, whether that be a group session or an individual session with a patient, is critical to the acquisition of skill for that patient. It's important to see the patient as a learner of movement and motor skills. If you view your rehabilitation in this vein, then the notion of creating an optimal practice session is self-evident for rehabilitation and physiotherapy practice. The optimal structure will often depend upon the type of skill to be developed, i.e. the what, the performance setting, the where, and the patient's unique characteristics, i.e. the who. There are a number of questions therapists need to consider when structuring their rehabilitation practice sessions with their patients, including the following. So in this short video, we will tackle some of the following areas: the timing of the skill practice, whether to use block or random practice, the level of variation to use in a practice session, whether to use mass or distributed practice, and whether to use whole or part practice. The timing of skilled practice. The timing of skill development training is important for therapists to consider. In general, when we are teaching patients new movement skills, we want the patient to be as fresh as possible. So, a low level of fatigue is important and assumed to be optimal for skill development. A practical example that most therapists can attest to is in the ward setting, in which the patient does not want to engage in rehab at the end of the day because of fatigue. In an outpatient setting, it would be unwise to work on motor control of the shoulder during a reaching task early in the patient's rehabilitation after, say, 4 sets of fatiguing external rotation strengthening exercises. However, in the latter stages of rehabilitation, when the patient's motor control is relatively stable, there is probably a case for practicing those original skills under a state of fatigue. In this regard, the length of the skill development session should be relatively short and very focused to allow a high degree of quality of practice. But, that said, once the movement skills again become relatively stable, the case for longer sessions may be important to challenge the patient's ability to retain stable movement patterns under the duress of fatigue. Block and random practice. Block practice is a situation in which all the repetitions of one skill are performed one after the other. In this video, you see me performing the same skill over and over again. This is a common practice in physiotherapy rehabilitation. While this is a very effective method of learning a closed skill and initially learning the basic requirements of that skill, the long-term learning potential and retention of that learning is often reduced. Its effectiveness has been shown to be reduced as the complexity of a skill increases and the patient becomes more competent. So for example, block practice of step-ups in the physio gym for a knee replacement patient may be okay initially. However, this practice structure may not carry over and prepare the same patient for walking upstairs in a busy shopping centre. In the video, this is a classic example of block practice. However, the research suggests that when you have skills that require a high degree of cognitive demand or movement complexity, because the skill is more open, a random practice structure is better for long-term learning. This is thought to facilitate long-term learning because of a higher degree of cognitive modulation. Exercises are organised in a random order with one exercise followed by a repetition of a very different exercise. In random practice, it is often the case that the patient never really gets it right because they are always on the very edge of a correct repetition. Hence the old adage in strength and conditioning to make sure that you coach it ugly. The level of variation. On the face of it, the level of variation seems like random practice under a different guise. Well, this practice structure is exactly what it says on the tin. It's the opposite of constant practice of an exercise or skill without deviation from the original skill. So if your patient performs a step up in the gym in exactly the same way for every repetition, the way they are performing it will not have changed. Now, similar to block practice, this is beneficial during the initial learning stages of skill development, but it's unlikely to lead to long-term learning and, importantly, retention of learning in a complex environment, because there's very little need for a high level of cognitive analysis by the patient. Whereas adding some variety to the starting position of the step up or a sit to stand that you give to your patient could be the game changer. Changing the patient's sensory experience, adding a cognitive demand, adding the holding of a bag during a step up, stepping up onto a pillow, i.e. an unstable surface, adds a lot of variation and appears to be superior for long-term motor learning, especially in open and complex environments. Mass and distributed practice. The way skills practice is distributed in a practice session can affect skill development. We are all aware as therapists that early skill development is best achieved with limited fatigue, which is why we should encourage patients to take regular breaks between practices. This is important in the early stages of skill development. As patients become more competent and develop their motor skills, they will reach a point where they become more tolerant to fatigue, i.e. they will develop fatigue resistance and consequently will require less time to recover during a practice session. This is where mass practice can be very valuable, because a greater density of training can be undertaken with less and less need for breaks. This allows the development of the patient's capacity to perform skills under fatigue. This can be a very useful way of structuring your practice sessions for patients that are returning to occupations and sports where they are required to perform under high levels of fatigue. Whole or part practice. Movement skills can be broken down into various parts. For example, if a lower limb patient is being taught to negotiate a 45-degree turn during a change of direction task, this can be broken down into its constituent phases. The entry to the cut, i.e. the acceleration phase, the plant phase, i.e. the deceleration phase, and the exit phase, i.e. the re-acceleration phase. The therapist is able to teach each phase separately and then to put together the whole movement skill. This is an example of the parts to whole approach and is a very useful method for complex activities. This chunking of parts can make a very complex task much more manageable to teach. But with all positives, there will be negatives. In the part practice method, a potential disadvantage is the patient may not always see the link between different movement components. However, this can be overcome by taking a whole part whole approach to your practice sessions with your patient. This approach offers the patient the opportunity to see the entire movement skill in its entirety. It also offers the therapist the opportunity to identify the key performance aspects of the task that they need to focus upon. So in the above example, the therapist would review the patient's change direction ability during the whole task, pick out the parts that need coaching, and then undertake part practice of the phase requiring additional work before then going back to the whole task. So I hope you got a ton of information off the back of this video, and I really hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget, if you want to find out more about us, you can go to our website www.integratedclinicalsnc.com. Also, we're on Twitter and also we're on Instagram as well. And so, please come and join us. Let's help put rehab back into physio rehabilitation. Bye for now.